joined by someone who has been observing the royal family for a few decades, I think it's fair to say, but primarily focusing on the politics surrounding the royal family and indeed the country they call home. I'm talking this afternoon to Paul Osborne, who is a journalist with 20 years' experience with the BBC and other news outlets in the UK. You find yourself down under during one of the biggest events in the UK, though, Paul. What's going on and how do you feel?
Yeah, it's been a slightly odd experience, to be honest, because, as you say, I worked in journalism in similar roles to yours for more than 20 years now, and mostly, as you say, talking about politics and talking to people in the news and this kind of thing. But as a little kind of side job, I was asked quite a long time ago if I would think about coverage of not just the death of the Queen, but of other senior members of the royal family. It's something that people will have noticed in the last week or so. There's an awful lot of material been sitting in shelves or on computers waiting for this moment. And I was one of the people whose job was to think about how that would work and put it all together. And that was off the back of working in other places where, and again, you'll probably, this will probably sort of strike a chord with you, that one of the first things you're told when you work in pretty much any radio station, certainly in the UK, is, and this is the cupboard, and it did literally used to be a cupboard at the back of a studio where we keep all the stuff for when the Queen dies. So it would be the old tapes with the obituary programme that would tell you the Queen's story. It would be the CDs of the music that have been approved to be suitable and not offensive to anybody. And crucially, the bit of paper that said, this is what you do, these are the people you phone, this is the order you phone them in, this is who you have to get permission from to make certain it's absolutely right before you say it. So, yeah, it's always been in the back of my mind, and every so often, every year or so, you'd come back to it and you'd update it with what the Queen, what the other members of the royal family had been doing, and make sure everything was up to date, make sure all the scripts made sense, make sure everybody knew what to do and who to call, because it is one of those things that you've got to get absolutely right. You're not going to get a second chance to do it. And then while all this was going on at work, at home, I was always sort of planning this move to Australia with my wife, who's originally from Brisbane, and it's been delayed a little bit over the last couple of years, obviously. But the restrictions were lifted and we decided to move out. So I said goodbye to all my work colleagues, came over here with these two things that I've been working on. I've been following sort of Boris Johnson around London for ages when he was the mayor of London and working his way up to being prime minister, covering elections, covering Brexit, all of that. And then he fell on his sword very quickly. I think pretty much as I was unpacking the suitcases, he was resigning. And then the other thing that I'd always been preparing for was this moment. And again, I find myself on the other side of the world when the text messages started arriving from all the people I used to work with.
What have you noticed about the coverage in Australia? And also, what have you noticed about people's reaction to coverage in Australia, Paul?
I was a little taken aback by the extent of it. I always knew, and certainly back in the UK, we had a lot of complaints when the Duke of Edinburgh died last year that there was too much coverage, that the BBC, for example, took every other programme off air for the whole of the day and much of the next day. And there was a feeling that it was all a bit compulsory and you had to watch this and you had to feel sad about it. And some people complained about it. And we used to say in meetings afterwards, if they thought this was a lot of coverage, wait until the day when we're talking about the Queen passing away. And while still at the moment there are very few programmes, certainly on the main BBC television channel in the UK, there are very few programmes that are not about the Queen, and it will be like that until the day after the funeral. Here, that first warning, that update about the Queen's health came in middle of the evening around 9 p.m. I started speaking to some friends and back in the UK, and they're saying, oh, we do think this is it. The giveaway was when the presenters on the BBC News switched to black suits, black ties a few hours beforehand. And then when they announced it, which was at about 3:30 in the morning, my phone went crazy. I got up, stumbled into our living room, put the television on to see all-out coverage, not just on the ABC, but on commercial TV channels that would normally be far more interested in ratings and game shows and entertainment programs than they would be in this. And it has continued. So I think the thing that surprised me was you got to Saturday, you got to Sunday, there was still very, very extensive coverage. It shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did. I was here about 8 years ago now, coinciding with a trip that William and Kate were paying to Australia. And again, it seemed that everywhere we went, they'd been there 2 days before. We were in Brisbane, they'd been here 2 days before. We were in Sydney, they'd been there 2 days before. And I was a little bit, why is everyone so over the top, saying to friends, you can't move without seeing it on the television. And then a friend of mine who'd been living here longer said, you have to remember in the UK, there's a royal visit more or less every day. Pretty much every day, a member of the royal family is doing something, visiting somebody. They don't come to Australia that often. And so when they do, it's a very big deal. And I think you've seen that these last few days.
Paul Osborne is with you, journalist with a few decades of experience covering politics, the royals, planning for the big news story that you're living through at the moment. And that is, of course, the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and the rise of King Charles III. Paul, as now an observer as well as someone still involved in media, do you think that all of the stories that people like you had been planning for are as interesting to most Aussies as stories that maybe hadn't been planned for? And you mentioned the former Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, now Prince and Princess of Wales. They're part of the young royal contingent, which includes, of course, Harry and Meghan, Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Are people as interested in the Queen or more interested perhaps in this new generation of royals? And will they ensure that people remain interested in the royal family, do you think, or perhaps undermine?
I think you'll see as time goes on, and obviously as we move further away from the funeral, as the King's household take over, and we've talked in the past about what direction Charles might want to take the royal family in that is different in some ways. You'll see that develop. But I think what's interesting is that certainly the last 15, 20 years, I think there's been a marked separation in the way public opinion, certainly speaking for the UK, was towards the Queen as towards the rest of the family. And the Queen was sort of sacrosanct. After the death of Diana in 1997, when again there was a lot of criticism of the response from the royal family, of things like why wasn't there a flag at half-mast, why did it take so long to come to London, these kind of things. That came after this period of intense public interest in the royal family. Arguably, historically, they caused this themselves. There's a very famous film called Royal Family that was made by the BBC and ITV jointly in 1969, broadcast in 1969, was seen by more than 30 million people, was shown in Australia a couple of months later, huge audience, was shown to about 350 million people around the world, was the most intimate portrait there has ever been of the royal family. And it followed them doing what you would think of as quite mundane things, like having a picnic. No, they had a barbecue at Balmoral was filmed. There was a shot, famously, people used to say the Queen never carries money, but in this film, there's a scene where she takes Prince Edward, who would have been about 7 or 8 years old, into a shop and buys him an ice cream and all these kind of things. While on the one hand, the public adored it, and it was a huge success, there was a sense that what it did was it demystified the royal family, that there was this mystique around them. Now, David Attenborough, now, of course, famously presenter of wildlife films, at the time was a manager in the BBC. He was in charge of one of the BBC television channels, and he warned the director of this film, you could kill the monarchy by doing this because you remove the mystique of it. He said something about, in a tribe, the tribal chief does not let everyone else into his tent because it destroys the mystique. And once you do that, the mystique is gone and the tribe will fall apart. And he just felt that it was potentially a dangerous thing to do, to remove that mystique, to make them look ordinary in a way. But what it did was it unleashed this fascination with the royal family as subjects of gossip, as tabloid figures. So through the 70s, you had Prince Charles. Who is he dating now? Who is he going to marry? Then, of course, he did get married, and we had this parade of newspaper stories about Princess Diana. Then the marriage problems affecting not just him, but others of the Queen's children. The events of 1992, when the marriages fell apart, Windsor Castle burned to the ground. The Queen talked about this annus horribilis, then the death of Diana. And there was just this feeding frenzy of newspaper coverage, which I think at that point the Queen's children had been through that process. And after the death of Diana, there was a more, I think, respectful attitude to the Queen from around the time of the Golden Jubilee. There was this recognition of this life of service. And she was, as I say, seen as a little bit above all of this, a little bit sacrosanct compared to the others. But now, of course, her grandchildren were moving into adulthood. And so we became fascinated with who William and Harry were dating. We became fascinated with Harry in the army going on deployment to Afghanistan, with some of the other things that caused controversy in his life, and then obviously his marriage to Meghan Markle and everything that's flowed from it. They talk about this thing called an invisible contract. This idea that there was this non-written, non-verbal contract that exists between the news media in the UK and the royal family. The royals need the media because they need attention and publicity to maintain public interest. The media need the royals because they sell newspapers and they attract viewers and they attract listeners. Now, Prince Harry described this as, in that famous Oprah Winfrey interview, he talked about it as, if you are willing to wine and dine the reporters, if you are willing to give them access, they will give you good publicity. And that's the way it has always worked. I don't see that ever changing. I think that it will probably take the new king some time to establish himself as a figurehead. Obviously, there's all this talk about he has been able to be an activist as Prince of Wales. He's been able to advocate for causes and has himself recognised that he can't do that now as monarch, that he has to step back from some of that. And I think it will obviously take time before we start to see how this royal household is going to look differently to others. But the idea that the fascination and the tabloid headlines are going to end with the passing of the Queen, I think if anything, they'll probably be stepped up. I mean, you've seen, things on Twitter the last couple of days about those little flashes of frustration that you've seen, particularly it seems relating to pens with the king at the moment and signing all of these documents, which on the one hand completely understandable because he has just lost his mother. He has been through this extraordinary week of intense activity. But on the other hand, people say, as I heard one person say a couple of days ago, you watched this thing we got very annoyed with this pen in Belfast, and it was turned to his friend and went, Queen wouldn't have done that, would she? And all of those kind of things are going to carry on. And the fascination is not going to fade, but neither is that very harsh edge to the coverage.
Well, we will wait and see as the events unfold. Paul Osborne, I have a feeling we'll be speaking again. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.